In the spring of 1217, the Kingdom of England stood on the edge of disappearing. A French prince held London. A 9-year-old boy sat, barely, on the throne. And the man entrusted with saving the realm was 70 years old, an age at which most knights of his era were long dead or long retired. His name was William Marshal, and for 8 centuries he has been called the greatest knight who ever lived. Whether that title was earned or manufactured is a question historians are still arguing over. By the end of this video, you'll have every angle. The verdict is yours. If you appreciate this type of content, gently tap that like button. Let's dive into it. William Marshal was born around 1146, the 4th son of a minor baron, which under the inheritance customs of the period meant he was entitled to nothing. No land, no title, no guaranteed future. At the age of 6, his father's castle at Newbury was besieged by forces loyal to King Stephen, and the elder Marshal was compelled to surrender his son as a hostage to guarantee the terms of a truce. When his father broke that truce and refused to give up the castle, King Stephen threatened to kill the boy in retaliation. What his father reportedly said in response is not easily forgotten. According to the Chronicle, John Marshal declared he still had the hammer and the anvil with which to forge still more and better sons, choosing the castle over his child. Stephen, in the end, could not bring himself to do it. William lived, but he carried that into the rest of his life, the understanding that nothing would be given to him, not even safety, not even by the people who were supposed to protect him. It was on the tournament field that he turned that understanding into a career. Medieval tournaments were staged battles, but they were not gentle ones. Knights fought to physically capture their opponents and claim their horses, their armor, their ransom. William became a legendary tournament champion. On his deathbed, he recalled besting 500 knights over the course of his career. Early on, he and a partner, Roger de Gorgi, captured 103 knights within 9 months alone. And by the time his competitive years ended, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, was calling him the best knight that ever lived. A verdict delivered at burial by a man eulogizing him from a tradition of commemoration rather than scrutiny. It is a phrase that has followed Marshal through 8 centuries of retelling. It is also worth remembering where it came from. That reputation carried him into royal service, and he stayed there for nearly 50 years. He served 5 English kings in succession: Henry II, the young King Henry, Richard I, John, and Henry III. The most remarkable moment of those years under Henry II came not in a tournament, but on a battlefield in France. In 1189, with Henry II in his final decline and his son Richard openly in rebellion against him, Marshal was tasked with covering the old king's retreat. During the flight from Le Mans to Chinon, Marshal found himself face to face with Richard and had him entirely at his mercy. What he did next has been debated ever since. He chose not to kill him, driving his lance into Richard's horse instead, and leaving the future king unhorsed in the road. When Richard later accused him of attempting murder, Marshal replied that he was not so far gone in his years that he did not know where to put a lance. It was a precise, deliberate act of restraint, sparing the man who would become his next king, while making absolutely certain he knew it had been a choice. Marshal is considered the only man ever recorded as having bested Richard in combat. Richard did not forget it. When Henry died weeks later and Richard took the throne, one of his first acts was to reward Marshal with the hand of Isabel de Clare, giving him, at the age of 43, the lands and title he had spent a lifetime earning. That reward came under Richard. What came under John was something harder to earn: survival. John turned on his own barons routinely, and many men who served him at close range did not come out the other side with their lands, their titles, or their lives intact. Marshal did. He survived John's suspicion, his catastrophic losses in France, and the baronial rebellion that followed, and somehow emerged from it all still standing, still trusted, still whole. Very few of his contemporaries could say the same. There was a deeper test of that loyalty too. In 1183, the young King Henry, dying, asked Marshal to fulfill a vow he himself had made, to undertake a crusade to the Holy Land. William kept that promise and journeyed to the Holy Land in late 1183. Almost nothing is recorded of what he did once he arrived, only that he fought and served honorably, and that somewhere in that silence he quietly committed himself to the Knights Templar, a vow he would not fulfill for another 36 years. The defining moment of his life arrived in October 1216, with the death of King John. Henry III inherited a kingdom in which an enemy occupied the richest third of the realm, including London, Winchester, and most of East Anglia. The threat came from Prince Louis of France, brought into England the year before by rebel barons, and now in command of most of the country. John's final meaningful act as king was to name William Marshal regent for his 9-year-old son. Marshal, 70 years old by then, moved immediately to have Henry crowned at Gloucester, and pledged that the boy king would honor the Magna Carta, a promise meant to pull wavering barons back toward the crown. Everything came down to Lincoln in May of 1217. French and rebel forces under Thomas, Count of Perche, had laid siege to Lincoln Castle, defended by the constable Nicolas de la Haye. Marshal called England's castle-holding nobles to a muster at Newark, gathering roughly 400 knights and 250 crossbowmen, along with additional infantry, before marching to break the siege. On the 20th of May, his crossbowmen forced their way through the city gates and took up positions on the rooftops, firing down into the besieging army, while his knights and infantry charged the French line head-on. The Count of Perche was killed in the fighting, and his army broke. It was a decisive defeat. Louis's cause never recovered, and his invasion of England collapsed in the months that followed. A contemporary chronicler, with a kind of dark irony, called the sack of the city afterward the Lincoln Fair. None of this, however, comes without a caveat. Much of what survives about Marshal comes from a single source, a biography commissioned by his own family shortly after his death, written by men who had every reason to cast him in the best possible light. Some historians have pushed back on parts of the legend as a result. The 500 captured knights is Marshal's own deathbed claim, not an independently verified count, and even his contemporaries occasionally accused him of being more interested in profit and reputation than in honor for its own sake. None of that erases what he did at Lincoln, but it's worth knowing that the greatest knight who ever lived is in part a story Marshal's own family helped write. William Marshal died 2 years later, in May 1219, formally received into the Knights Templar on his deathbed, and buried at Temple Church in London, where his tomb still stands. At the graveside, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, looked down at what remained and said, "Behold, all that remains of the best knight who ever lived." He had gone from a child his own father was willing to sacrifice, to a man 5 kings depended on, to the one person who held England together when it very nearly came apart. Whether that makes him the greatest knight who ever lived, or simply the most effectively remembered one, is a question the sources were never designed to answer honestly, and one that 8 centuries of historians have not managed to settle either. This has been a production of History Recast. If you enjoyed this video, please click the link and check out one of our other stories.